All right. Good afternoon, everyone who is live with us today. Thank you for joining us for the second of a two-part webinar series on CAR-T. My name is Sabrina Hanna. I am the Managing Director of the Cancer Collaborative, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion entitled Looking Back to Move Forward, Lessons from the Implementation of CAR-T in Canada. In the next hour, we'll get insights and experiences from experts and thought leaders that have been involved in its implementation, each panelist bringing a wealth of knowledge and expertise. Their contributions promise to make this discussion enlightening and impactful. There will be some time at the end of the discussion for a Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions into the chat as they come to you. But before we get our discussion started, I'm honored to have with me today Dean Duffin, who is the CEO of a Calgary-based startup. He is also a dedicated husband and father to 3 children, William 14, Sammy 11, and Lucy, who's 9. In 2015, his son Sammy was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. Sammy's doing well today, but Dean and his wife Kelly are passionately involved in the kids' cancer community and specifically the advocacy of new cancer treatments and support for kids and their families. Dean is actively involved with the Advocacy for Canadian Childhood Oncology Research Network, also known as ACORN, and sits on the board of Kids Cancer Care. Dr. Mona Shafee is a clinical associate professor in the Division of Hematology and Hematological Malignancies and medical director of the Alberta Blood and Marrow Transplant Program. She completed medical school and residency training at the University of Ottawa in 2008 and completed fellowship training in hematopoietic stem cell transplantation at the University of Calgary in 2010. Her clinical and research interests are in malignant hematology with a focus on the management of patients with lymphoma and CLL, including the use of cellular therapies, stem cell transplantation, and CAR T-cell therapies in the treatment of these diseases. Dr. Judith Glennie is the president of J.L. Glennie Consulting, Inc., providing a range of strategic advisory services to nonprofit, government, and industry clients. Judy is a senior member of the healthcare community with over 25 years of experience in the national and international pharmaceutical policy world. A clinical pharmacist by background, she has held roles in strategy, policy, teaching, research, and patient care in the payer, regulatory, industry, clinical, and academic environments. Her public policy background includes a Master of Science in Community Health Science and lots of on-the-job training. Prior to returning to the consulting world, she was with Janssen Canada, where she led HTA policy initiatives as well as post-marketing effectiveness research, strategic planning, reimbursement submissions, and market access strategies. And Katia Ottoman joined Gilead in 2018 as Associate Director, Market Access and Government Relations. During this time, she has collaborated on policy and access strategies with multiple stakeholders in the healthcare sector to enable patient access to new healthcare technologies, including CAR T-cell therapy. Prior to joining Gilead, she worked for Roche Canada for 13 years, where she was part of an international assignment program for 3 years, leading access and policy strategies in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Katia launched her career with the British Columbia Ministry of Health and achieved success in tobacco control policy. Her education includes a Bachelor of Science from the University of British Columbia and postgraduate studies in health policy from Dalhousie University and executive business from the UBC Sauder School of Business. First off, thank you to the 4 of you for being here today. When I think about my own work in the CAR-T landscape, which started back in November 2017, I was having conversations about how CAR-T would be effectively implemented in Canada. So people knew it was coming, they were preparing for it, but sometimes it seemed like we were surprised by it. So we had an opportunity to set a precedent and become leaders in the implementation and delivery of CAR-T, but that didn't happen. And then I wonder why not. There were some things that we did do well, and one of the things that have always stuck with me is one of our colleagues who was working in the space at the time said we're finally one country, with Health Canada and both health technology assessment agencies, CADIT and INES, working in collaboration. So with that in mind, Judy, I'm going to start with you. From your perspective, what are some of the things we did well in the delivery of CAR-T?
Thanks very much, Sabrina, and thank you for having me today. I just wanted to preface my comments today by saying that I've not been directly involved in specific to CAR-T implementation. So the comments that I'm sharing with you today are based on public information, on my analysis and review of how CAR-Ts were managed. Their entry was managed particularly by the HTA and payer environment. So just to put that on the table. I mean, I think what we did well was, as you said, take sort of an integrated approach, I guess is the best way to put it, at least at the HTA and to some extent Health Canada level, where there was the opportunity for information sharing amongst those bodies to get an understanding of what this new disruptive kind of technology meant to patient care, the kinds of data that are relatively unique to CAR-Ts, certainly not the data standard, quote unquote, that HTA bodies would have been used to. And you know, at least at CADTH, there was sort of a tailored approach to evaluating these products that included issues of ethics, that included issues of the implementation issues. So it was a much more holistic approach to evaluating these products than what was typically applied to new therapies in the cancer space. So I think those would be the good things. I think there are a lot of other lessons that we need to learn from the flip side, though, and I'll save those for now.
Thank you, Judy. I think while I was talking, I heard somebody laugh a little bit. So, and I think Katia, that might have been you. So, I would like to hear from industry perspective some of the things that we did do well in the implementation of CAR-T.
Sure, yes, and thank you also for inviting me today. First of all, I just want to kind of highlight why we're talking about the issue. There are over 155,000 Canadians affected by blood cancer, and I think we're just in the early days of October, but last month was Blood Cancer Awareness Month, so I think it's a time to think about those people who are diagnosed with blood cancer. I think every 24 minutes somebody's diagnosed. I personally have a sister-in-law, I have a college roommate, and I have a colleague who have all been suffering from blood cancers, so very near and dear to probably everybody's home and hearts. I think that CAR-T is a good example of how we can really work together because it represents a valuable opportunity for Canada to really establish a critical foundation for equitable delivery of not just the CAR-T, but cell and gene therapies, which are really going to be the mainstay of our medical technology coming forward. So this is bigger than just CAR-T. To echo what Judy said, I think that there was really good industry collaboration, actually, with CADTH, ENES, and PCPA. As Judith mentioned, there was a need for CADTH, ENES, and PCPA to all evolve how they had traditionally reviewed drug therapies. There was some discussion whether this was a drug or a device, and there was a bit of a hybrid approach. It was a bit more comprehensive, including, as Judy said, more of an ethics and an implementation component. And industry had to adapt as well and provide those dossiers to the organizations. So I think that worked well. It was obviously a learning and can evolve further. But I actually think what worked even better was the industry collaboration with provinces, so with governments across Canada, with healthcare professionals, with health service agencies, with physicians. This was a very new technology, and it's actually a real partnership. So previously, industry would produce a new technology and literally sell it to a province for healthcare providers to utilize. And in this case, it was actually a whole partnership between our company, the governments, and the healthcare providers to set up the infrastructure to actually be able to use CAR-T. There's specialized training, resources, et cetera. And I think 3 provinces in particular really stood out because they prioritized this therapy and they brought it to the Canadian marketplace very quickly, Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. So I think that was a real success. And shortly thereafter, even small provinces like Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan as well. And then I think industry collaboration with groups like the Cancer Co-Lab as well, Sabrina. Your organization has worked closely with us to make sure that patients, caregivers, and policymakers are getting the latest information and the support they need. So I think that's also been a huge success.
There are so many things that you have said just now that I would like to unpack further, but I'm going to let Mona speak now and get her perspective as a clinician on what we did well.
So who's the we? I just want to know whom I'm commenting on.
Well, we as a country, but you as a clinician.
Okay, so I think that what we did well was advocate for our patients to get access to this treatment as soon as possible. We had already had a business plan kind of in place in October of 2019. After we got the Health Canada approvals and CADTH, submissions for these treatments. And if it weren't for COVID, we probably would have had access to CAR-T earlier because it was sitting on the Minister of Health's desk in January of 2020, and then it sat there for a few months because of the bigger COVID pandemic. But I think that despite the COVID pandemic, we thought this therapy was life-saving for our patients, and we knew we'd have to open it. And so we worked really hard as a group. I remember getting a letter signed by all the hematologists in Alberta, sponsored by the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, to put pressure on the Ministry of Health to allow us to send patients out of country to get CAR-T while we were waiting to set up our own, because that had not been established in Alberta, and other provinces were already regularly doing this. Our neighbors to the left, BC, had been sending patients, pretty regularly at a high cost. And Ontario was still doing that as well, because I know they had a center open, but they couldn't meet the demand. So they were regularly sending people to Boston and the Mayo Clinic and that sort of thing. And we made the argument that Albertans were at a disadvantage because our government wasn't allowing us to do that. So they quickly responded, actually within 3 weeks of that letter. And I was able to send a patient to Seattle in May of 2020 to get CAR-T. And she actually stayed in remission for over 3 years after that treatment. And I have another one who's still in remission 3.5 years later. So those are the kinds of stories that we appreciate and through, as I said, through advocacy for our patients. But obviously we wanted to treat closer to home. And in August of 2020, there was an announcement for funding for CAR-T in Alberta. And I spent the next 4 months, which was actually pretty quick in terms of the turnaround time, to get a standard of care CAR-T up and running. And I did this simultaneously, not just with Kite Gilead, but with Novartis, which had the other available CAR-T products. So we basically did 2 onboardings at the same time. And within, as I said, I think it was less than 6 months, we were able to open the CAR-T program in January, which I was told was one of the fastest turnaround times for launching a CAR-T program. And that's through the efforts of everybody who's part of the operations committee for CAR-T in Alberta. We have a lot of key people that were like-minded, really wanted to bring this treatment to our patients. And so we're quite happy about that. And since then, pediatrics is on board, Edmonton's on board for standard of care. So now we can service the entire population of Alberta. And we're certainly committed to have this ongoing. We have a lot of key people still in those positions, leadership positions, who care a lot about CAR-T. We've managed to convince Alberta Health that CAR-T is important, not just for standard of care, but also for research. And so I would say that we're also leading the country from a supportive care piece for clinical trials, for investigator-initiated clinical trials in particular, which is really something to be proud of.
And what I've heard from the 3 of you so far is that collaboration was really something that everybody was doing with the implementation of CAR-T, which is not something that we have seen generally with the implementation of other innovative cancer medicines. Don't want to take into your time, Dean, but I think what we saw that was different from the patient perspective is that there was this willingness from Cadith NES to work with the patient groups. And, normally we're always hounding on them to work with them, but this time they were coming to us. But Dean, from the pediatric patient perspective, what do you think we did well in that space?
Well, I'm not as familiar with the approvals process as all of you, so it sounds like you guys did an amazing job working together and collaborating. From the clinician standpoint, I know that the doctors on the ground, and I mostly know the pediatric world, being just a father, right? I don't have the expertise and the background that all of you do. But from the pediatric space, they were well aware of the technology and the life-saving potential of this treatment well before they were allowed to, administer it. So from that aspect, I think the clinicians did an amazing job, and the team specifically at the Alberta Children's was amazing. But yeah, in terms of the positive, I guess that's all I could say, because the timeline, although it got done through all the hard work and stuff, the timeline did bother us, because we were accepted into CHOP as a backup plan if the transplant didn't work in 2015. So for it to only be available here in 2021 is, yeah, so that's kind of, I'm sure we'll go into that process in the future, but yeah, I'm super impressed with the ability and the knowledge of the patient care. It's just the delay in getting to the treatment, which I'm sure we'll dig into it a little deeper.
We will when we get into the next topic. Judy, did you want to say something?
Can you see me now, Sabrina? No? Oh, okay.
No.
Well, no, I think we're going to go into, and I think those timelines were not amazing, and I think that is something we can talk about in the next segment.
Well, I think one of the things that was maybe not done well, but there was a willingness on behalf of the provinces to have CAR T available to patients. And I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. We did see it didn't go through as a drug through Cadith, for example, and even in NS, it went through as a medical device. And, is it because the provinces wanted to find budget for it somewhere else from other than their drug budgets? It's possible, but does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I love your positivity, but I'm not sure willingness is one of the words that I would use from the Alberta perspective. Like, it took, after my child, obviously we were aware of this situation, and we knew, Kelly and I, my wife, that there was going to be kids that were stuck in limbo when this treatment could save them, but wouldn't. And so we were very aware, and the team of doctors in Calgary introduced us to a patient that was exactly stuck there, and it took an immense amount of pressure to get them to fund the trip to Ontario. The willingness was not a word I would use to describe the funding piece. Like, I know it sounds like the clinicians and the drug companies and Cadith maybe were working together at the time, but actual delivery of this treatment was very tricky in that in-between stage there.
Mona?
Yeah, I would have to echo that. Honestly, it was heartbreaking at the time when we knew this treatment was available and being given to Canadians elsewhere. And then as an Albertan, we couldn't get it. And that really hurt. It hurt us a lot. That it just seems very unfair. And it felt like, why did we have to do this? Why do we have to jump through so many hoops to get access? Because they're an Albertan, right? But I'm going to have to say it's turned around completely, where we have the access now, a lot more than some other provinces. So yeah, there's a lot of pain at the beginning, and a lot of patients who died waiting for treatment. And I think in the pediatric world, it's even more important because pediatric cancer in general is a rare tumor. It's a rare disease. Whereas in the adults, I can understand fussing about volumes and other things, but they are pediatrics is a special group, and if it weren't for the public outcry and advocacy on the part of the public, this probably wouldn't have happened.
Judy?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus in on the timelines piece and how prepared. There's a difference between the collaboration that eventually happened versus how prepared provinces, PCPA, etc., were for HTA bodies even. And I remember having a discussion with the then CEO of CADIF, and it was around novel technologies, and saying, if I can sit in my basement office and know that CAR-Ts are coming, and yet the HT body has not really thought about how they're going to be evaluating these products, that's a problem. And so they're really, and I know companies were out there years in advance. I mean, Sophie Rochon, who used to be with Novartis, did public presentations on the time and effort that they put into trying to prepare the environment for the challenge of these disruptive therapies and how people needed to start thinking about it. And yet, the HTA process took around this usual amount of time, give or take, even though it was a slightly modified process. But we still waited from, January 15 of 2019 to October or December of 2019 for Ontario and Quebec for the funding of these CAR-T products to actually happen. So all those implementation challenges, which we could have seen addressed in parallel to and as part of the HTA process, resulted in a significant, that's another 10 months or 9 months of time that these kinds of patients cannot afford. So they're really, while eventually everybody started to collaborate, the proactiveness of HTA bodies of payers really, they really were not as proactive as they should have been for this kind of a disruptive therapy. And they figured it out eventually, but we see this exact same pattern happening with even quote unquote regular oncology products. That's where I've done most of my analysis, where different provinces end up funding products at different times, and we know that some provinces are more proactive in evaluating and dealing with some of the implementation issues in parallel to either the HTA or the PCPA pricing negotiation process. And they don't leave it till after everything is done to start thinking about, okay, how do we implement this? And so all provinces need to get better at this, not just with these disruptive therapies, but frankly with all therapies, because especially in the oncology space, patients don't have time to wait.
I feel like we've already started our discussion in the second part, but Katia, I will let you speak and then we'll officially go into it.
Perfect. Yeah, actually, I still wanted to comment on the positives and what went well before we switch gears. But I think there's obviously patients who waited, and in the pediatric space, that is absolutely heartbreaking. One thing that I noticed working with governments across the country is some variation in how governments approach this. So some governments, as Dr. Shafi already pointed out, were quite quick to send patients out of country to get care. Other provinces were faster at acknowledging that this needed to be an in-province program. And one thing I think that went well were the provinces that acknowledged that quite quickly and actually, in a very transparent process, put funding into their annual budget. So most provinces announced their health budget in sort of the February to March timeframe. And there were provinces, Alberta being one of them, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, who actually very publicly and transparently put money in the budget and then worked quite quickly to make that a reality in their province. So I think that was something that was quite notable for CAR-T that I hadn't seen for other drug therapies. And I think the other piece that's been a real success is the number of patients who have benefited from this treatment. And I know Dr. Shafi has already mentioned 2 patients that she had personally. But there have been thousands of patients. I think there's something like 16,000 patients who have been treated globally with our product alone, hundreds in Canada. Patients have had like 75% of patients have had a durable, experienced remission, long-term survival from just one treatment. We've had a 99% manufacturing success rate as well. So I think, I started with talking about the people affected by this disease, and I think one of the massive successes of the number of people that have benefited from these therapies so far in Canada.
Are you on mute, Sabrina?
You're on mute, Sabrina.
Thank you. So I was just saying, as important as it is to recognize what we did well, it's also important to acknowledge where we fell short. And Moni, you talked about, patients who died waiting to receive CAR-T. So I'll start with you on what could have been done better, not just as a clinician, but within the whole cancer care system. What could have been done better?
I don't know. I don't know what could have been done better on my side. I mean, it's really hard when you're a clinician and you see, as I said, other Canadians have access that we do not. And the application form for out of country was just ridiculous. I remember arguing back and forth over 6 weeks. They would, it was just felt like they were stonewalling every time I asked or tried to advocate for my patient. And I think it's because that particular department really had no idea what this treatment was or what it meant, and that it was unique compared to other therapies. And when we weren't talking about research, we weren't talking about clinical trials or experimental therapy. This was standard of care, and that the only reason why we couldn't give it in Alberta is because we just didn't have the infrastructure in place for it. They didn't understand that this is time limited, that, the idea is we are going to have our own program up and running. This is just temporary. And so as I said, I don't think we could have done anything different on our end. And then the COVID pandemic really screwed things up, right? Nobody expected that to happen. And the fact that we were able to get a program up and running despite the COVID pandemic, concurrently with a record year for stem cell transplants for our program as well. I think that speaks to how motivated we were about getting this treatment available. So honestly, looking back, I think everything was done the way it was supposed to have been done. The only significant delay for me was the 9 months from when we submitted the plan to when it was actually approved.
As a clinician, though, are there things that you would have liked to see happen in Alberta differently so that you could have quicker or more timely access to CAR-T?
Well, we've obviously learned from those mistakes, and we are proactive. For example, at the end of this month, we're submitting a new request for a grant for the next 3 years because of the rapid changing nature of CAR-T and new therapies. We didn't want to have a certain amount of funding that would be insufficient 3 or 4 years from now. So we've applied for a grant planning for new treatments that we anticipate over the next 3 years in the hopes that eventually it'll be part of standard operational budget. So we can only go with what we can predict. So right now we have at least 3 other products that are coming, 4 other indications that are going to add about 40 to 50 adult patients for CAR-T every year in Alberta. So we don't have any of those funded yet, but they're going to go through the negotiations over the next six months, I would say. And we, as a program, want to be ready to go. So we've already thought about this. We've put it into our request. We're submitting it at the end of the month, and we should have it available to us as early as March of next year. So it won't be us this time. That's the stumbling block. It will be the more national organizations, the PCPA for the negotiations, There will be some things that we would like to facilitate. I think contracting and other things is always important to try to reduce those times as much as possible. And I think Alberta's been pretty good about speeding that up compared to some other places. So I think, as I said, I think we've learned our lesson and are planning for the future.
Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Mona said. You know, the number of new products that are in the pipeline for new indications as well as existing indications, perhaps earlier in earlier lines of therapy. One of the challenges in my discussions with clinicians in Ontario, particularly, is capacity. I mean, it's one thing to get a product through the process and get the negotiations done, et cetera, but what we're running into is limitations at the sites in terms of manpower, in terms of beds, infrastructure, to be able to deliver these therapies. And you know, that, as Mona has alluded to, takes a lot of planning to get those decisions made, to make those investments, to create the beds. And looking at different ways of managing these patients. Frankly, right now, many of them have to stay in hospital or very local for a period of time to be monitored, and looking at ways to get those patients closer to home, but still have that high quality monitoring happening. So there's a lot of sort of structural challenges outside the actual, you know, getting the drug or the product funded, the CAR-T product funded. That as we see more and more patients qualifying for therapy and more products, are the ongoing challenges that you see happening within the health system. So I think we need to be conscious of those kinds of things as well. So it's not just what's happening with the drug evaluation and funding, it's other parts of the system need to be prepared as well.
Yeah, and in terms of I think those are things that I would like for us to discuss further in the lessons learned section. But in terms of the payer perspective, what are some of the things that you think could have been done better?
I mean, I think, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think, you know, figuring out what all of the infrastructure related, and I don't just mean human resources and beds, et cetera, but also funding processes and how to negotiate these products, et cetera. You know, anticipating that, you know, especially when you're dealing with a brand new kind of technology, being proactive and starting those negotiations, frankly, in parallel to the HTA process. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the HTA recommendation came out in January of 2019, and funding finally started to flow in December 19 for Ontario and October 19 in Quebec. So even between provinces who were all participating in this process, there were, you know, in my mind, I'm sorry, inexplicable delays between why patients in Ontario had to wait 2 more months than patients in Quebec, let alone that they had to wait, you know, 9-10 months in order to get access to those therapies after the HTA recommendation. So, and as I mentioned earlier, this is not happening, it's happening not only with CAR-Ts, but it's happening with other gene therapies. It's still happening with, you know, relatively routine oncology regimens or products. So being more proactive and not allowing what are, for all intents and purposes, administrative processes of negotiation of a price, creating that much of a delay for patients who are at high risk of their disease progressing to the point where they're no longer qualified for the therapy. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that payers need to get much better at.
I think one of the things that we saw with the first generation of CAR Ts, and especially in all the other jurisdictions, was these outcomes-based agreement. And for some reason, Canada just didn't want to get into outcomes-based agreements. And I can't understand why, especially in a pediatric population that has like about 50 children who would be receiving, who would be eligible to receive CAR T. Like, why couldn't we use that as a pilot project to see how outcomes-based agreements could work? And Katia, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I think in the positives, I mentioned how there was good collaboration between industry and HTA bodies, but I do feel that the HTA methodology does need to evolve. It does need to reflect these high-tech cancer treatments that are potentially curative. I think what we see in Canada is different than in European countries where these outcome-based agreements are quite widely used. We have 13 different countries, if you will, in our country. And so the collaboration between provinces is where we could get better at, and then potentially invest some resources so that the provinces can work together and establish this type of methodology, which I think is better suited to CAR T, exactly what you said, especially in the pediatric setting. And the timelines really need to improve. I mean, when we launched the first indication for Yescarta, there was some level of understanding that these processes were new and there was a lot of collaboration that needed to happen. But then when we launched our second and third indication, and quite frankly, we're now launched our most important indication, which is the second line setting. So it's people getting CAR T earlier before they're as sick, where they're probably going to benefit better. And we're actually seeing it take longer almost than it did with the first one. So even though there's established pathways in place, it seems to be taking a really long time, much slower than in Europe. You know, patients in Europe and most countries have access to these therapies much earlier than Canada. And so I think that's something that we really need to work on. And the other piece is the equity. So I talked about how we're sort of 13 different countries within a country, and we're seeing quite a bit of difference in access, speed of access for patients in different provinces. And 20% of Canadians still have to leave their province to have CAR T. And when I say leave their province, it's not even necessarily the next door province. It could be all the way across the country. So those are some things that could probably be addressed with better transparency in cancer control plans, advanced planning, better budget planning, and a real commitment to sustain investment and faster timelines in Canada for the reimbursement process.
Can I jump in on that transparency piece? I think that's a really important one, because when I've ever chatted with doctors about this process, and Mona's already described how it felt like they were stonewalling, whatever justification they're utilizing to make these decisions or decline requests is one thing, but they need to say, in my opinion, why they're making these decisions. Because like in the specific case of CAR T, if they were concerned about economics, the doctors were more than willing and able to do a second stem cell transplant to try to save a relapsed patient, where everyone at the time knew CAR T, and that's not a free service, right? That's an expensive process with all the time in hospital, the nurse, the time in the beds, the medications. So they were trying to compare an apple and an orange as if it was a vacuum, and they would, like, the doctors weren't going to give up on these kids. So if they were utilizing economics as a justification, they needed to be clear about that so that it could be addressed and explained further, the actual logic of it. So if they're going to be faced with tough decisions, and obviously budgets are not infinite, they have to draw the line somewhere. Like, that's common sense, it makes sense, but they need to be open about the logic they're utilizing to make the decision, so a good rebuttal could be made as to why. Because in the CAR T example, there was it was so strange why it took so long, because it was obvious. If from every angle, it was 100% obvious. So we need to look at why those no's were given, why it took so long, and try to have more accountability in that process so it can be addressed specifically going forward.
Well, I see that you added a comment in the chat, but do you want to speak to it?
I mean, I think that's what happens when we talk about what the current standard of care is for a patient who can't get access to a new therapy. And when you mentioned the second stem cell transplant, we would never be questioned about doing that. We have free reign to do this, even though the data to support it is quite poor, to be honest, and the outcomes are small, but it's a very resource intensive procedure. And it costs a lot of money depending on, whether you use a related or unrelated donor. There's a whole bunch of costs added to that. Not to mention the cost of the patient themselves with all the toxicity associated with it. So for us, I think that, as someone who's been through advocating for patients for new therapies. I've been on CADTH committees for review of new products. I see both sides, and the idea, when you're on the opposite side trying to make a decision, you're not just making a decision for an individual patient, right? You're making a decision for an entire group, everybody coming forward who meets certain criteria. And I think our issue is we know what the criteria are. This is what it is. This is what we want to offer. This is why, and why can't you see this? Why can't we just have it? Like, we have access to Yescarta and third line. It's CADTH supported, so we know it's coming. It's not going away. We know it's coming, and yet I have a patient now I can't give treatment who I know will do better with second line CAR T, and instead I have to give unnecessary toxic treatment in order for them to fail before I can get third line treatment. It just makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And these toxic alternatives, like you said in the chat, they're much more expensive than giving the one-time CAR T. But just, looking at the time, I want to make sure that we move on into the lessons learned. And I feel from our conversation, there was a lot that we could have improved on, or that we can improve on, versus what we did well. So this time, Dean, I'd like to start with you. What are the key takeaways for moving forward and ensuring that we have timely access, we have pathways, we don't, are not taking all this time to produce the paperwork, that patients are getting it closer to home? I'm going to stop there, but for you, what are the lessons learned, the key takeaways for doing better for patients now?
I have, you guys all have a better understanding of the approvals process, but if you could wave a magic wand and somehow streamline those organizations and have them more connected from federal to provincial, has got to be one of the things that something needs to be considered or explored, right? Because if you have a extensive approvals process at one level, that is only the tip of the iceberg, and then getting it approved provincially and subsequently funded provincially, that just inherently is going to cause delays that seem unnecessary. And when it comes to saving lives, that something needs to be done there. I won't take up too much time because I know the others have more, but the one thing that I've really become aware of is that the amount of advocacy required to move the needle on some of these topics. So I would just challenge or request that the clinicians and the doctors try to engage the organizations in their communities to help with this, because like our team, and I can never do one of these without mentioning Dr. Gilcher and how awesome he is, but he's so busy saving lives, he doesn't have time to fight the red tape, right? Where there's a lot of energy and capability outside of the healthcare system that want to pitch in and help on these topics. So I would just encourage, the doctors and anybody else in the approvals process to try to harness the horsepower that's out there in the surrounding communities to help to lobby and advocate on these very important topics, right? Like there's a graft versus host drug that they're having a tough time getting access to in Alberta right now that I became aware of earlier. Like it's going to be perpetual. And as science advances, we're going to always have to be pushing for quicker adoption. So the more people that are working on it at the same time, the better, whether it's inside or outside of the system. That would be my main kind of thought for the future.
Mona, go ahead.
So I would just echo what Dean said from an advocacy piece, because to be honest, they don't listen to the physicians. That's been my experience, that when things are slow, they don't actually care about our opinion. And it's only when I recruited the public, usually, big patient organizations, to complain that things got moved. And so I would definitely involve patient groups sooner rather than later when it comes to new treatments. And we're already doing this. So somebody had mentioned gene therapies. We have some that are coming for sickle cell and thalassemia. And so we are already now working with the patient groups to start that process as soon as possible, even before these approvals are available. We just think that public awareness, that this is important and that this is coming and this is needed, needs to come not just from the physicians who are on the front lines, but from the parents and the patients, the people who are directly involved, the voters, essentially.
They don't always listen to us, but I think they're more afraid of us. So, Judy, you already talked a lot about capacity and being proactive, but I think that there's an opportunity to expand. And then if you have other thoughts on the lessons learned.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that at the Health Canada HTA interface, there are already opportunities, and it's up to companies to take advantage of these opportunities to shorten that time frame between Health Canada approval. So there's opportunities for parallel reviews that enable Health Canada and the two HTA bodies, CADTH and INES, to do parallel evaluations and really shorten that time between Health Canada approval and HTA recommendation. So those kinds of systems exist. To me, the issue is at the pricing negotiation level, PCPA, and then the provincial level listings or funding decisions. And to me, the way to move the needle on that is frankly not to deal with the bureaucrats, it's to deal with the politicians, and to say that it is not acceptable to us as patients, as clinicians, that we have to go through an administrative process for a drug or a product that has been recommended for funding, but wait around for months while people get their act together and figure out what the right price is. Other countries have done this where they implement pricing and then retroactively deal with they implement funding and they retroactively deal with the funding and negotiations. The UK has done this with Tagrisso in non-metastatic lung cancer. So, I mean, there are lots of examples internationally. It's a matter of willingness. And the only way to get the bureaucrats to be willing is for the politicians to push it down through the system. And there may be a new opportunity with a new executive or new CEO of the new PCPA organization to move that forward. And I think it's an eventuality. We just need to get that whole process sped up. Otherwise, it'll take another 5 years before they start doing something along these lines. So that would be my recommendation.
I think, what we see in this space, and especially, as an advocate, it seems like the patients are always taking the brunt of the risk. So what did we learn from CAR-T so that we can start to distribute that risk amongst the different stakeholders, and specifically between government and industry? Katia, I'll let you start with that one.
Tough question. I think there was a lot of wisdom in what Judy was just speaking to. So I alluded to the fact that a lot of countries in Europe have access earlier than Canada does. And I think there's a lot to be learned there, and a commitment both from Canadian governments as well as industry in Canada to work together to make some of those a reality so that patients have faster access. I think there's also an opportunity for everybody to continue to share their voice and what they think is a priority. So I know, Dr. Shapey, you said that governments don't listen to you, and Sabrina, you said that governments don't listen to you, but actually I think as a collective, decisions in our healthcare are made because a variety of voices are speaking to what is a priority. And I think that your voice does really make a difference, everybody's voice together, and it has made a difference. And that's why we are where we are today, and patients do have a lot more access than they have. So I applaud all of you for bringing your opinions and your advocacy forward. I think it has made a difference in Canada. I think there's some sharing between provinces that can happen as well. There's been, a lot of different decisions made by different provinces, and if those provinces work together and share best practices, I think we can move some provinces a little bit further ahead by lessons learned by provinces who have taken a different approach and have a bit more CAR-T experience as well. And I think that transparency piece that I mentioned before, I mean, if you get ahead of it and you plan, and I know that's what Dr. Shapey was talking about in Alberta, really planning ahead. And so, yeah, so you can really, you're not running behind the 8 ball. You're actually determining what budgets are needed, how many patients need to be treated, what resources do we need. Do we just lose Sabrina? Uh-oh. I just saw her disappear from my screen. Anyways, if all that planning is done and it's done in a transparent manner and it's in a provincial cancer control plan, then we're going to be a lot better off in the next few years. There you are.
Oh, here she's coming back.
Yes.
There we go. One thing I will mention is Sabrina comes back because she was talking about sort of the industry and government piece. I mean, and patients getting caught in the middle, and I think that's quite correct. The whole PCPA process, the whole pricing negotiation process, is about trying to figure out, who's going to wear the risk. Whether is it going to be industry or is it going to be government, or how much are they going to share the risk? That's what pricing negotiations are all about. And as they figure that out, patients and clinicians are waiting. And again, in my mind, there is no reason that patients should have to wait while those two bodies sit down and figure out who's going to wear the risk, especially after there's been a positive health technology assessment recommendation for a product that is, disruptive, innovative, very high unmet need, et cetera, which by definition, pretty much all these products are. So, I think the fact that right now we find it, quote, sorry, I'm using air quotes here, no one can see me, but the fact that we find it acceptable to allow people to wait while these administrative processes are going on. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I mean, that's what I think we have to make the argument about. The royal we, societally, and say that, that isn't acceptable anymore. And find different ways of getting a better balance and keeping more focused on what patients' needs are, because patients are wearing the risk here, and that is not part of what they talk about in PCPA negotiations between industry and government. The risk to the patient of waiting is not being acknowledged, and that's a big picture policy discussion to fundamentally change how we do these negotiations that I think needs to be met.
If I could just add to that, it's not just the HTA review, which is typically about 6 months, and that's post Health Canada, but the actual negotiations themselves often are not starting promptly after a CADTH or ENAS recommendation. So in the case of Yescarta for a second-line treatment for patients, it was 7 months before the PCPA contacted our company to start those discussions. And I think, what Judith is saying, those are patients waiting an extra 7 months for absolutely no reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really unfortunate that it is patients who are carrying the risk when it comes to this. I don't know, how do we change that? Does anybody, Dean, do you want to maybe take a stab at that? I know that's a big question, but
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how to change it. I think just more pressure, more engagement at the politician level, because like Minister Shandro at the time in Alberta, he did come have a meeting at Kids Cancer Care that I was at and brought up this topic very specifically with them. And I think that whether or not it was already in the works or not, or if it did move the needle, I'm not 100% certain, but it has to be at that level because the current system is too slow, it's too cumbersome. In certain points, it's completely illogical. So yeah, it needs to be finding time to get higher up at government and force those changes down back through the system. I think that's the only way any material change will happen in a short timeline.
and speaking of patients who are waiting, I really did want to bring up what's happening in British Columbia. And I don't know, Katia or Judy, if you want to take a stab at that, because for some reason, and Katia, you said it before, how there are variations in how the provinces were approaching this, but most had were putting some funding for CAR-T, and we just haven't seen that. I mean, they did announce in February that they were going to have their provincial CAR-T program, but we're just not seeing that. So why is BC an outlier?
I think it comes down to government priorities and government commitment. And each province has determined a different path forward. British Columbia has been sending patients initially out of country and now out of province. But I don't think that patients are seeing the real benefits that they are in other provinces. Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, especially right away made it a priority to have an in-province program as soon as they could. And I think Mona can speak to, the results they've had from patients being treated in province. I know those were presented recently at a conference versus provinces that have had to send patients out of province. And now I think British Columbia is playing catch up. Now they're seeing that this creates further delays. Patients don't have the same success. So in February, the minister in BC did announce a CAR-T program, and now they're starting, where Alberta did 3 years ago, and going through all of the steps to try and make that a reality. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that will come to fruition soon. But, it was a different decision made 3 years ago, and I don't think it's had the same patient benefits.
Judy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in discussions that I've had with clinicians out in BC, and this is earlier this year, it apparently comes down to funding and really giving funding to the BMT program at the Vancouver General to create the capacity to take this on. So yes, they have been sending patients out of province, out of country for quite some time. There's also, sort of an academic CAR-T clinical trial program that I understand both Alberta and BC are involved in. I don't know how much of impact that has had in terms of the delays in those big picture infrastructure funding decisions that need to be made. But it all comes down to funding those the beds that are needed and the infrastructure that is needed to enable this, the extra capacity that's needed to provide that CAR-T program, from what I understand.
All right, well, we're just coming up on 1 o'clock. So I want to take the time to thank our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. Our conversation has been enlightening and inspiring. And while there are areas for improvement, it's important to acknowledge the dedication of the healthcare professionals, the policymakers, the patient advocates, and industry who have made a profound impact on the lives of cancer patients. And this discussion is not just a reflection of the past, but a call to action to leverage the lessons for even greater progress in providing cancer care for Canadians. So thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging. The recording of this webinar will be up at Cancer CoLab within 48 hours, as well as the recording of the first webinar, which is already available there. So thank you so much to everyone who's here, and thank you so much to the panelists.
Thanks very much, Sabrina.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank you for all
Sabrina.
your hard work, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.